Okay, so let's untack this incredible figure. We are plunging headfirst into, I mean, probably the most turbulent and revolutionary era of the New Kingdom. We're talking about the Amarna period. And at the absolute center of this storm is an icon who remains, well, perhaps the most recognizable female face in all of antiquity.
You know, it's almost impossible to separate the historical Queen Nefertiti from the iconic image that defines her today.
That bust.
Exactly, that bust, the one in the Nies Museum in Berlin. It's so much more than just a masterpiece of feminine beauty. It is the physical manifestation of an entire strange, brief historical moment. It is the face of revolution.
And the story of its discovery is just pure drama. We really have to start there. I mean, you have to imagine the scene. It's December 6th, 1912 at Tel El Amarna, city of Akhetaten.
Right, and this team, a German team led by archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, they're meticulously digging through the rubble. And they're in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose. They're looking for historical treasures, obviously, but what they find just transcends archaeology.
So they find, what, like a bunch of plaster heads and molds?
Yeah, incomplete sculptures, that kind of thing. But then there it was, the head of Nefertiti, almost perfectly preserved. It still had traces of its original vibrant colors. And Borchardt, who was known for being, you know, a very reserved, almost stoic kind of man, he was just utterly aback.
He wrote about it.
He did. In his diary, he described the face as the embodiment of serenity and composure. I mean, can you imagine unearthing something so untouched and expressive after 3 millennia of sand and obscurity? It must have been breathtaking.
That moment really sets the stage for our deep dive perfectly. Here you have this woman who is a global symbol, yet despite that universal fame, Nefertiti remains one of the most enigmatic figures of the 18th dynasty. And the reason why is just fascinating.
It is. It's because the rulers who followed her and her husband, they tried desperately to erase the entire Amarna.
Not just forget about it, but actively erase it.
Precisely. They systematically scrubbed the names, they dismantled the temples, they effectively created a 40-year historical void. And that is why our sources are so contradictory, so fragmented, and why so much about Nefertiti's life.
Her parents.
Her parentage, her true political power, and especially the circumstances of her death, it all remains purely conjectural. We're piecing together a puzzle with most...
So our mission today is to sift through all these conflicting historical theories, all built on these tiny fragments. We need to explore the religious revolution she co-led with her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten.
The man history now labels the heretical king.
Right. And we need to trace the political turmoil and the potentially violent end that defined the close of her reign, all based exclusively on the records we actually have concerning this chaotic era.
And just to set that initial context, Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Akhenaten, started his life as Amenhotep. They were the couple who briefly established capital, Akhetaten, and centered all worship on a single son, the At.
And this wasn't just a minor change, like swapping one god for another.
Oh, not at all. This was an earth-shattering religious, artistic, and social experiment. And Nefertiti wasn't just on the sidelines. She was actively co-leading it right there at the king's side.
To really understand Nefertiti's power, we first have to place her in the right context. So section 1, the identity puzzle. She was born into the absolute zenith of the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty. What did that golden age actually look like?
The 18th dynasty was the definition of an empire. I mean, we're talking about a time following the example set by these incredibly powerful military leaders, pharaohs like Thutmose III. He expanded the realm deep into Syria and the Levant.
So they were conquering.
Big time. And this military might secured just immense prosperity under Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who would become Nefertiti's father-in-law. His reign lasted for nearly 4 decades. It really was a golden age, marked by incredible wealth and, for the most part, political stability.
And crucially for our story, this dynasty was also characterized by the incredible political power that royal women could wield. This really sets a standard for Nefertiti.
Absolutely. The precedent had been set long before her. I mean, you just have to look at Hatshepsut, who ruled as a king, a full pharaoh, in her own right for 2 decades.
Unbelievable.
And then immediately before Nefertiti, you have Queen Tai, Amenhotep III's great royal wife. Tai's status was enormous. She was active in diplomacy and religious life. Her importance is just highlighted by the sheer quantity of archaeological...
Like what?
Well, for one, we have over 50 marriage scarabs that detail her parentage, her background, and the huge extent of the kingdom ruled by her husband. Nefertiti was born into this environment where queens were not just figureheads, they were active political participants.
So Nefertiti herself was likely born somewhere between 1370 BC and maybe as late as 1355, all during Amenhotep III's long reign. But we immediately run into the biggest question mark of all. Who exactly was she?
Right.
Her name, the beautiful female has arrived, has fueled one of the earliest and I think most persistent theories about where she came from.
That's theory one, the foreign princess. And you're right, the names seem to imply an outsider, someone who had literally just arrived in Egypt to marry into the royal family.
And there's a specific candidate, right?
There is. The most cited candidate for this was a princess named Tadukipa from the kingdom of Mitanni in what is now northern Syria. She was sent to marry the old king, Amenhotep III, late in his reign. And then when he died, she became one of the wives of Amenhotep IV, the man we now know as Akhenaten. Timing fit.
But if we look closely at the source material, there's a pretty strong counterpoint to this. While Tadukipa certainly existed in the court records, there's no direct evidence, none at all, suggesting that Nefertiti or her sister Mutnejmet were foreign.
It's a huge hole in the theory. If she were a foreign princess of that stature, you would expect certain accompanying records or diplomatic correspondence, some mention, and those are just missing.
So that leads us to the next idea, theory 2, the royal sister. This one feels very Egyptian, given the 18th dynasty tradition of pharaohs marrying their own sister.
Often to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline, so it was a natural assumption that Akhenaten's sister.
But here again, the evidence, or lack of it, really complicates things, specifically her title.
Certainly do. Other queens who married their brothers, they bore explicit documented title. King's sister, king's daughter. Nefertiti, despite the dozens of extravagant titles accumulated, conspicuously lacks both. You never see those ancestral titles.
Which makes the sister theory pretty hard to sustain.
Very difficult. It just doesn't fit the weight of the evidence.
Which forces us into theory 3. And this is the most tangled one, involving a general and an aristocrat named Ai, a man who will become a king himself much later in this whole drama.
Ai is by far the strongest candidate for her father, or at least someone extremely close. He held this key title.
Which sounds important.
It is. And in the context of the 18th dynasty, that title might have been used to designate the king's father-in-law.
Okay, so that's a big clue.
A very big clue. Additionally, we know from a tomb inscription that Ai's wife, a woman named Tai, not to be confused with the Queen Mother Tai, was explicitly mentioned as Nefertiti's nurse.
Her nurse, not her mother. That's a key distinction.
It's a critical distinction.
Well,
so the most sophisticated subtheory here suggests that Nefertiti was the daughter of Ai, but from an unknown earlier wife who might have died young.
And this is where the genealogy just gets truly labyrinthine.
It does, because there's even some evidence that Ai himself might have been a brother of the great Queen Tai. And if that's true, it would mean that Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten were actually first cousins.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very neat family tree. But modern technology has really destabilized these old ideas, hasn't it?
Completely.
Yeah.
You can build this very tidy, logical family tree, and then you bring in the 2010 DNA studies that were conducted on the mummies from the Valley of the Kings. And those studies, particularly involving the mummy of Tutankhamun's mother, they throw a massive wrench into the Aya theory.
So just for the listener, how exactly does the DNA complicate?
The DNA analysis suggested that the mummy known as the younger lady, who was identified as Tutankhamun's mother, was also a full sister of Akhenaten.
Full sister.
Meaning she was a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. This is a critical point. If Nefertiti was Aya's daughter, she simply does not fit that genetic profile.
So we have two competing facts here. A major court figure, Ai, is strongly associated with Nefertiti, but the DNA indicates Tutankhamun's mother was an unnamed full royal sister. How do Egyptologists try to reconcile this?
It forces a highly specific, very refined sub-theory. For the Ai connection to still hold any weight, Nefertiti would have to be the daughter of Ai and an unknown princess who was also a sister of Akhenaten.
So this unknown princess would have to have married Ai, given birth to Nefertiti, and then died young enough for Ai's later wife, Tai, to become Nefertiti's nurse.
Exactly. It's an incredibly specific and, frankly, somewhat circuitous path. It just demonstrates that Nefertiti's origin is still one of the most frustrating, unsolved mysteries of the Amarna period. So much of her early life is pure speculation.
But that speculation ends the moment she officially married. Because regardless of where she came from, we know her status after marrying Akhenaten was just immense. She married him a year or two into his reign, likely when she was only in her mid-teens, and she succeeds his incredibly powerful mother, Tai, as the great royal wife.
And her titles, they truly reflected this elevation. She wasn't simply queen. She was accorded titles that placed her on a near equal political footing with the king himself.
Like
titles like Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, Mistress of All Lands, and Lady of the Two Lands.
So these titles do more than just sound impressive.
Oh, they fundamentally underscore the exalted, almost co-regent status of royal women during this specific era. And it's this political foundation that allowed her to help launch the revolution that would...
Okay, so that foundation leads us directly into section 2. Launching the Aden cult and moving the capital. This is where Nefertiti and Akhenaten really began shifting the religious, artistic, and political landscape of Egypt in ways that had just never been seen before.
And she first appears alongside her husband in the archaeological record at Karnak in Thebes at a brand new temple complex they built that was dedicated.
And this early period is just defined by this total artistic upheaval.
It really is. Akhenaten was already being depicted in the radical Amarna style, that strange, elongated look, characterized by a low jaw, a narrow waist, and almost feline facial.
It's such a shocking departure from traditional Egyptian art.
A profound departure. It was a complete break from the static, idealized, proportional depictions that had defined Egyptian art for centuries.
And what was the purpose of that? Was it just an aesthetic choice, or was it theological?
It was absolutely theological. It was designed for shock value. The Amarna style used these exaggerated, even unnatural forms, like the almost androgynous body shape, to signal the beginning of a new age, one that completely rejected the conventions of the old priesthood. It visually reinforced that this king and his queen were charting a new, radical path.
And Nefertiti goes along with this.
She does. Interestingly, she initially used a more transitional style that sort of smoothed out some of those radical features, but very soon after, she adopted the full, strange Amarna look, which really demonstrates her commitment to this revolutionary aesthetic.
Early in the reign, we also see this very puzzling ceremony celebrated in year 2 or 3, a Hebsed Jubilee. We have to pause here because that's just highly irregular.
It is. The Hebsed Jubilee was the traditional marking of a pharaoh's 30th year on the throne. It was a ritual meant to regenerate the king's vitality.
So I have one in year 2.
The timing is the source of so much scholarly. The leading theory is that this wasn't really a personal jubilee for Amenhotep IV, for Akhenaten. Instead, it was a grand celebration held in honor of his Rhys father, Amenhotep III.
Oh, well.
It would have coincided with what would have been Amenhotep III's 4th jubilee, celebrating his assumption of the Asin form in the afterlife.
So this subtle continuity suggests that Akhenaten's religious changes, even in their most radical early stage, were presented as an amplification of his father's policy, not a total break.
Exactly, not a complete revolution out of nowhere. And that continuity is further backed up by the evolving iconography of the At. Initially, the deity was shown in an anthropomorphic form, based on the established sun god Ra-Harak. Yes, but during that early jubilee, the depiction immediately shifted to the now famous symbol, a sun disk with streaming rays, each one ending in a...
And those hands are often holding the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal couple.
Right. And this visual links directly back to portrayals of Amenhotep III during his first jubilee. So again, the cult didn't just appear from nowhere. It was an existing solar tradition that Akhenaten and Nefertiti amplified, centered, and then eventually made.
But here's where Nefertiti's political and religious status becomes truly staggering. Even by the high standards of the 18th dynasty, her representations at Karnak are just utterly unique.
Unprecedented is the right word. In the Karnak records, Nefertiti is shown performing the ultimate defining act of Egyptian kingship, striking down her enemies.
The smiting scene.
The smiting scene. And this representation was almost exclusively reserved for the king himself. It symbolized the pharaoh's duty to defeat chaos, or Isfet, and maintain cosmic order, Mat. To see a queen depicted this way highlights an exceptionally high, almost equal religious and political.
And it goes even further in the Hupenben, right? This crucial structure within the Aten complex, maybe the most sacred inner sanctuary.
Yes. The sources we have indicate Nefertiti appears there as the sole officiant, with Akhenaten the absent.
What's that?
It elevates her role beyond that of a great royal wife, or even a co-regent. She is performing the essential daily rituals to the Aten all by herself. It suggests a unique religious mandate. If you connect this to the broader picture, it demonstrates that in the Aten cult, the royal couple served as the sole mediators between the Aten and humanity. And if Nefertiti could perform that function solo, she was an indispensable, active, divine partner.
Okay, so despite all this building work at Karnak, a massive shift occurred between year 4 and 5, around 1346 BC, when Akhenaten decides to just move the entire capital. He changes his name, and Nefertiti changes hers.
Correct. Amenhotep IV becomes Akhenaten, meaning effective for the At. And Nefertiti's name is lengthened to Neferneferuaten Nefertiti, which means beautiful are the beauties of the Aten.
And this public renaming was the ultimate act of commitment.
It was. It symbolized their complete break with the Amun tradition that was embedded in their...
So, why the move? Why abandon Thebes, the spiritual and political heart of Egypt, for centuries, and build an entire city from scratch in the middle of it?
Well, the inscriptions on the boundary stelae at Amarna, they offer the official religious... They state the land chosen for Akhetaten horizon of virgin land, belonging neither to gods, nor to kings, nor to private...
A blank slate.
A total blank. But the consensus among scholars is that the Aten cult was simply not welcomed. The massive, wealthy, and politically entrenched priesthood of the god Amun would have represented immense
So governing from Thebes would have been a constant political battle.
Exact. The move was a necessary political retreat to solidify their religious revolution away from all that entrenched opposition. Akhenaten needed that blank.
And Akhetaten was a city built entirely around the new faith.
Everything about it. Its design was revolutionary. It featured these massive open-air temples designed to let the Aten's rays shine directly onto the offering table, completely rejecting the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of the Umun Temple, the entire city plan.
The Great Aten Temple, the Small Aten,
the Pharaoh's residence, and even a separate residence for the king's grave. The city itself was a theological...
Let's talk about that radical shift in year 9. We often call this a move from polytheism to monotheism, but was it really that simple for the entire population?
The defining moment, I think, came in year 9 when the Aten's full name was changed. It dropped all references to older gods like Ra-Harakti and Shu. This signaled a hardening of the doctrine.
And at the same time,
simultaneously, the prescription of the Theban creator god Amun was implemented. His name and images were systematically erased across the entire empire, even where they featured in the names of individuals like the deceased Amenhotep III. That erasure of Amun is the true definition of the Amarna's radical.
This raises a really important question. Was Akhenaten trying to eliminate all the gods, or just Amun?
And that is the core scholarly. Some evidence suggests that Amun and Aten coexisted for several years. It seems Akhenaten himself demanded exclusive worship of the Aten, and he persecuted Amun specifically because Amun was powerful. He was the one who challenged the Aten's supremacy.
So he went after his main rival.
Exact. But there's nothing to definitively prove he actively prevented the wider populace, the common farmers and artisans, from continuing to worship the minor, traditional gods in their private shrines.
So the revolution was really a wholesale reorientation of state worship and power, exclusively focused on the Aten, rather than a universal, violent imposition of monotheism on every single subject.
That's a great way to put it. And of course, the later kings, the ones who restored the old religion, they had every incentive to claim Akhenaten tried to eliminate all the gods. It made his heresy seem more absolute, and it made it easier to justify erasing.
So what stands out here is that the new ideology was enforced through this dramatic artistic shift and the physical separation of the capital.
Yes, this new ideology, based on the literal truth revealed by the sun, was a major religious, social, and political change that dramatically raised the status of the royal family as the sole intermediaries between man and the divine.
And this radical new faith was about to be put to the ultimate test around year 12. So we move now to section 3, the zenith and the crisis. By this point, the royal family was settled in Akhetaten. They had 6 confirmed daughters: Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesempaten, Neferneferuaten Tashret, Neferneferur, and Sedapanri, the youngest.
And their plans for the afterlife continued to be just as revolutionary as their life. The royal tomb at Amarna, which we designate TA-26, was completely unique. It wasn't just a tomb for the king.
Right, it was a family affair.
It was intended for multiple occupants, including dedicated suites for Nefertiti and for their daughter.
And this idea of a shared eternity is visually reinforced in Akhenaten's own burial chamber, where Nefertiti is given this divine role in death.
Absolutely. Traditionally, the 4 corners of a king's sarcophagus were guarded by the 4 great funerary gods: Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selk. In Akhenaten's tomb, Nefertiti's image replaces all 4 of them.
Wow.
It's a massive theological chasm between the Aten cult and traditional Egyptian. It demonstrates her elevated role as a potential goddess of the dead herself, responsible for the king's revival. It reinforces the idea that the royal couple were the ultimate, singular divine source for all life, both mortal and eternal.
Now, let's bring in the other major player in this family drama, Tutankhamun. We widely accept Akhenaten was his father, but the identity of the boy king's mother is the single most intense and debated puzzle of the entire era.
The identity debate is a classic example of history versus science just clashing head-on. Candidate 1 for most of the 20th century was a woman named... She held this unique title, greatly beloved wife of the king, and she was important enough to have temple iconography and a sunshade built in her honor. She was a major figure at court.
But the source material shows Kia falls into disgrace around year 12. What does her sudden disappearance tell us about the political?
Her monuments were systematically rededicated. Her daughter's name was erased and replaced by fictional children, Meritaten Tashret and Ankhesempaten Tashret.
Fictional children?
Completely fabricated. The sheer effort to wipe her memory suggests she was the victim of a sudden political or personal upheaval. The fact that the younger princess, Ankhesempaten, listed as having a child is chronologically impossible. It proves these were fabricated names designed to repurpose monuments without major...
So Kia is out. That leaves us with candidate 2, the younger lady mummy, which was found in tomb KV35.
Right. And the 2010 DNA analysis presented a very strong case for this mummy's mother. The analysis concluded she was a full sister of Akhenaten.
So a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai.
Exactly. And this led scholars like Zahi Hawass to suggest she was an unnamed royal sister who's taken as a minor wife, perhaps to ensure a purely royal heir.
And finally, that brings us to candidate 3. Nefertiti herself. Even with the younger lady DNA results, many Egyptologists still contend Nefertiti could be Tut's mother. Why is that?
This is where the technical nuance is just so crucial. They argue that DNA evidence from 3,400 years ago, especially in a family with such extensive and repeated familial intermarriage, is incredibly complex to interpret.
So the results could be misleading.
Potentially. The data showing a full sibling relationship could actually be the result of 3 generations of first cousin marriage, a scenario that's sometimes proposed for Nefertiti's own ancestors, and that can create a very similar genetic profile.
So if that were the case, the DNA evidence wouldn't necessarily exclude Nefertiti.
Exactly. The debate remains unsettled, though Tutankhamun was likely born relatively early in the reign, around year 8.
Regardless of who his mother was, the family was at its absolute peak around 1341 BC. Year 12 marked the zenith of the Amarna period, and is recorded vividly in 2 similar reliefs showing a great celebration. What was this event all about?
It was a massive demonstration of Egyptian power and prosperity. They were receiving tribute from across the known world, rulers from the Levant, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Nubians, Libyans.
Everyone.
The inscription is undeniably boastful. It details all countries collected together at one time, bringing offerings to the king. It was meant to signify the successful completion of the city and the Eton cult, demonstrating Egypt's supremacy.
And the reliefs show the royal couple being carried in his grand litter, receiving gifts alongside all 6 of their daughters. It's a picture of perfect domestic and imperial bliss.
It is. But immediately following the celebration, tragedy struck, suggesting a profound crisis within this newly built city.
The celebratory zenith quickly turned into devastating mortality.
It did. The 2 youngest daughters, Nefernefer and Setaponre, died first and were buried in the royal. Then the second daughter, Mikataten, died soon after. She's shown in her tomb chamber being mourned by her parents and her surviving.
And it wasn't just the children.
No. Compounding this family loss, the Queen Mother Tai also died around.
That cluster of deaths in such quick succession, involving key members of the royal family, it points strongly to one conclusion, doesn't it?
It points to a deadly plague that swept through Amarna.
And the timing is just too coincidental.
It seems highly probable that International Year 12 celebration, designed to showcase their power, may have inadvertently brought disease, perhaps a highly contagious pathogen, into the densely populated new capital.
And a health crisis like that would have been an existential threat.
Absolutely. It would have shaken the people's confidence in this new religion, which was supposed to bring light and light. And it would have forced Akhenaten to confront his own mortality, especially since his only potential male heir, Tutankhamun, was still just a young boy.
This anxiety about mortality, coupled with the political instability created by the plague, leads us directly to Section 4, the succession crisis and the final incredible shift toward female kingship. Year 12 also marked the marriage of the eldest daughter, Meritaten, to a man named Smenkhare, who is one of the most enigmatic figures we had to deal with.
Smenkhare is a true historical ghost, you're right. His identity is intensely debated. He's a candidate for the male mummy found in KV55. Now, the 2010 DNA study identified that mummy as Tutankhamun's father,
which would make it Akhenaten,
suggesting it was Akhenaten, who died in his 40s. But many scholars still disregard that DNA evidence. They cite the anatomical findings that suggest the KV55 mummy died in his early 20s, which rules out the older Akhenaten and leaves Smenkhare as the...
But if Smenkhare was Akhenaten's younger brother, which is one theory, the DNA results could still confusingly match, right? Since siblings share so much genetic material.
Exactly. And this is where the historical debate over his kingship really... The dominant theory is that Smenkhare was appointed co-regent by Akhenaten. Well, anxious about the plague and needing a secure lineage, Akhenaten desperately needed a trusted family member, and a male one, to protect the 4-year-old Tutankhamun and the highly vulnerable Atenist. Smenkhare's marriage to Meritaten would have provided the possibility of more desperately needed heirs of pure royal blood.
But Smenkhare's reign was incredibly brief. Maybe just a year or two, and he's also believed to have died shortly thereafter, maybe from the same plague.
Right. And this must have created an immense political vacuum. Akhenaten was aging, he was likely ill, and there was no suitable male candidate left to protect his religious reverence.
So he turned to the person he trusted most, his most capable partner.
Nefertiti. We start to see her depicted wearing the conical royal blue crown, the kepresh, a crown that was typically reserved for kings.
Now, there was historical precedent for female kings like Hatshepsut.
There was, but there was likely great unease about making Nefertiti a full king since she wasn't technically a pharaoh's daughter.
But the sources suggest she did it anyway. At some point, shortly before Akhenaten's death, probably in the mid-1330, BC Nefertiti transitioned from great royal wife and co-regent to a full sole king She adopted the throne name Neferneferuaten under the full royal titulary of King Neferneferuaten.
And we can confirm this transition through the funerary items that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Crucially, we have a box that refers to King Neferneferuaten and names Meritaten as the great royal wife.
Which indicates a period of kingship.
Yes. And for decades, scholars confused this royal name with the male Smenkhare. They just assumed they were the same person.
So how exactly did scholars definitively confirm that Neferneferuaten was a woman and thus distinguish her from the male Smenkhare? Let's spend a moment on that crucial piece of evidence.
This is a perfect example of the importance of subtle epic. Early 21st century research uncovered the full cartouche for Neferneferuaten, and it included an epithet, a defining phrase that translated as beneficial for her husband. Her, a profoundly feminine epithet. It successfully separates Neferneferuaten from Smenkhare and strongly confirms that the female Nefertiti was the one who ruled as king. Her elevation was likely prompted by Akhenaten's desperation, his poor health, and the intense political
So Nefertiti, as King Neferneferuaten, likely reigned for about 3 years as the sole ruler after Akhenaten's death. And this is where we see the first political compromise of the whole Amarna period.
Yes, her reign as king likely lasted from Akhenaten's death up to year 3 of her own. And this is evidenced by graffiti that was discovered in a tomb chapel near Ab el-Khorn necropolis. Dated that graffiti is our smoking gun policy.
And the graffiti includes a prayer to Amun. Given Nefertiti's strong background as the chief champion of the Aten cult, why would a prayer to the very god they had persecuted appear during her reign?
It's highly unlikely she suddenly abandoned the At. The presence of the prayer to Amun and the possibility that her epithets might be read as beloved of Amun alongside beloved of At suggests she pursued a policy of religious moderation.
So she stopped the persecution.
She stopped the violent persecution of the Amun cult, likely restoring its worship alongside the At. This wasn't a theological preference. It was a move of critical political necessity to stabilize a kingdom that was just racked by plague, death, and so,
in this moderation, this attempt to steer a middle path may have been the very thing that led to her abrupt, violent end.
The evidence of her immediate post-mortem disgrace is strong. The fact that a large quantity of funerary items intended for Neferneferuaten were hastily reworked and used in Tutankhamun's tomb indicates her reign ended very abruptly. She was clearly denied the full ceremonial burial honors of a king. It suggests she fell from power violently.
And if we accept the identification of the mummy known as the younger lady from KV35 as Neferneferuaten, the evidence for a violent death becomes utterly compelling.
It provides chilling forensic detail. CT scans of the younger lady indicate she died relatively young, between the ages of 25 and 35. More critically, the scans show a large part of her left cheek is missing due to a massive wound. And the forensic evidence indicates this wound was inflicted while she was still alive and was almost certainly the cause of her death. This wasn't a desecration after death. This points to an assassin.
So if King Neferneferuaten was murdered, who killed the revolutionary queen?
Our sources offer two distinct politically charged theories. The first, and arguably the most likely, is that she was killed by the conservative elements, the powerful Amun priesthood and the traditional aristocracy. They were dissatisfied with her policy of moderation.
They wanted more.
They sought a complete, immediate, wholesale restoration of the old religion and viewed her half-measure as weak.
But wait, if she was murdered for being moderate, wouldn't the Amun conservatives just have waited for her to restore the old religion fully?
Yeah.
Why the violence?
Because 3 years of moderation might have allowed the Elton cult to solidify further, or they may have feared she would revert back to Akhenaten's strict monotheism. The violent, sudden end suggests an impatient, decisive political...
What's the other theory?
The alternative theory is that she could have been killed by the extremist Etinists, who viewed her decision to restore Amun worship, even out of political necessity, as a total betrayal of Akhenaten's revolutionary legacy.
So either way.
Either way, the message is clear. The middle path was not an option in Amarna.
The sudden and violent death of King Neferneferuaten Nefertiti around 1330 BC left the 11-year-old Tutankhamun as the sole king. And this instability is the prelude to Section 5, the aftermath and the erasure.
Tutankhamun's government was immediately dominated by powerful, established figures. You had Ida, Nefertiti's possible father, and the ambitious general Horemheb.
So the old guard was back in charge.
Essentially. And Tutankhamun and his sister wife, Ankhesenpaten, they initially kept their Aten-based names, Tutankhaten and Ankhesenpaten. The capital even remained briefly in Amarna. This suggests an initial period of cautious continuity.
But the shift was already in motion. Even while they were still in Amarna, a stele shows Tutankhamun making offerings to Amun.
That confirms the priority of restoring the old worship. And then came the official declaration, the famous restoration stele at Karnak.
And that stele is just a masterful piece of political propaganda.
It is. It explicitly states that the temples of the old gods had been neglected, and as a result, the gods no longer protect. It directly links the kingdom's misfortune, plague, the lost elect of the old.
And that statement justified the official return to Thebes.
It did. It justified reestablishing the traditional pantheon, and it justified the king and queen changing their names to Tutankhamun and Seneman.
And what followed this official reversal was the devastating systemic campaign of erasure against the Amarna heresy.
It was a ruthless undertaking, a deliberate attempt to strip memory from the historical record. The massive Aten temple at Karnak was systematically dismantled stone by stone.
They used the blocks for other projects, right?
They did. Images of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in that distinctive Amarna style were chipped away from monuments and repurposed. And they weren't just reusing stone. This was an active campaign to strip away the faces and names of the heritage and dedicate the material to the newly restored.
Thebes was firmly reestablished as the capital, and Amarna was just abandoned to the desert.
And this erasure didn't just stop at monuments. It extended to the royal bodies of the Amarna family, including Akhenaten and likely Smenkhkare.
So their bodies were moved.
Yes. The bodies of Akhenaten, Queen Tai, and the presumed Smenkhkare were eventually moved to Thebes to the tomb KV55, a space that itself was later. If Nefertiti is the younger lady, her body may have been moved to the more secure location 5.
But the final, most complete act of political oblivion came from General Horemheb, the last king of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb essentially tried to rewrite 40 years of history. How did he accomplish this political sleight of hand?
In the official king lists recorded by the succeeding 19th dynasty, notably those of Seti I and Ramesses II, Horemheb claimed to be Amenhotep III's direct successor.
He just skipped everyone.
He entirely bypassed the entire Amarna line. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun were all scrubbed from the record, despite Horemheb himself ruling for a decade and a half. He created a clean, uninterrupted royal timeline, making the entire Atonist experiment simply vanish.
This campaign of erasure brings us back to the burial controversy and the ultimate indignity that was suffered by Nefertiti. Tutankhamun's famous tomb, KV62, may have initially been intended for King Neferneferuaten.
That's the consensus now. The sudden, unexpected death of the 18 or 19-year-old Tutankhamun meant the court had to rush his burial. The tomb he was placed in was clearly a simple, not the grand royal tomb he deserved. It was hastily extended, decorated, and furnished using whatever material.
And what does the inventory of that tomb tell us about its original owner?
The fact that we find so many of Neferneferuaten's funerary items, including small statues that, while they're labeled as Tutankhamun, clearly show a female form, and a magnificent miniature golden coffin that carries Neferneferuaten's name, proves the transfer of goods.
So they were just grabbing things off the shelf.
Exact. And the best-known example is the middle coffin. It appears to have been originally manufactured for the male Smenkhkare, perhaps adopted by Neferneferuaten, and finally used by Tutankhamun. The pervasive presence of repurposed female grave goods confirms she was not buried as a king with the full honor. The entire burial south.
Okay, so despite the best efforts of Horemheb and the subsequent kings to erase her memory completely, Nefertiti defied oblivion. Section 6 explores this fascinating process of rediscovery and modern controversy, which culminates in the scandal surrounding her famous bust.
The erasure campaign was remarkably successful. Knowledge of the Amarna period was virtually lost for thousands until the 19th century. Yet, some fragmentary records did survive. The Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, writing as late as the 3rd century.
1,000 years later.
1,000 years later. He listed 5 kings corresponding to the Amarna period, and that list included a woman named Ak.
That is astonishing resilience. That 1,000 years after Horemheb's systematic destruction, the faint memory of a powerful female ruler from this heretical family somehow survived in the historical record.
But the true modern rediscovery began in earnest after the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone in the early century. Scholars, spurred by the wave of Egyptomania that followed Napoleon's accession, began the gradual, agonizing process of piecing together the Amarna from these chipped irises.
Scholars first noted the unusual elements of the Amarna style, the elongated, strange depictions in the mid-19th century. And by the 1840s, Akhenaten was identified as Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti as his wife.
Right. And the late 19th century added further critical layers, including the discovery of the Amarna letters, clay tablets detailing diplomatic correspondence, and key excavations by Flinders Petrie. These efforts shed significant light here.
And the possible monotheistic nature of Atonism was of great interest to religious scholars at the time.
Huge interest. They noted distinct similarities between the Great Hymn to the Aten and some of the Old Testament psalms.
But the moment that truly catapulted Nefertiti into global consciousness was the 1912 discovery of the bust by Ludwig Borchardt. And this is where the story shifts entirely from history to modern geopolitical controversy.
Borchardt immediately recognized the spectacular artistic treasure, but the process of its export to Germany was highly irregular and deliberate. The source material details how Borchardt diverted the bust to his house in Cairo, had it transported privately to Berlin, presented it to his financial backer.
And this was all done knowing the outrage it would cause in Egypt under the rules governing historical fines.
Absolutely. The bust was exhibited privately in Berlin in 1913, even for figures like Kaiser Wilhelm II.
Why did Borchardt insist that the Nefertiti bust be excluded from public display for so long?
He was trying to prevent Egyptian authorities from noticing that the most spectacular artifact of the season had been spirited away to Germany. The outbreak of World War I momentarily delayed any official inquiry. But then...
Tutankhamun.
Exactly. After the stunning discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in 1922, global interest in the Amarna family just exploded. And the Germans knew they could no longer hide the mask. The bust was finally revealed to the German public in March 1920.
And that's when the century-long repatriation battle began. Egyptian authorities immediately claimed the 1913 export was a mistake, citing potential fraud in the documentation process.
And the Prussian government initially agreed to negotiations to exchange the bust, but the public outcry in Germany was so intense that the government withdrew its consent.
And this conflict became political at the highest level, even under the Nazi regime.
It did. Hermann Goering proposed returning the bust to Egypt in the 1930s to improve diplomatic relations between Germany and Adolf Hitler, however, personally refused. He insisted the bust was to remain in Germany as the future centerpiece of a massive, planned, new Egyptian museum complex in Berlin.
The bust survived World War II, hidden in bunkers and salt mines, eventually being recovered by the U.S. Army. Despite Egypt's renewed claims for repatriation, American authorities handed the artifact back to the German.
And the bust was eventually returned to the restored Neues Museum in 2009, where despite the efforts of the post-Amarna kings to consign Nefertiti, she has become one of the most famous figures in ancient, due almost entirely to a single spectacular discovery and the controversy that has surrounded its ownership.
So what does this all mean? We've covered 2 centuries of scholarship built on contradictory records, DNA complications, and a dramatic cover-up that lasted 3 millennia. Nefertiti defied the efforts of later kings to erase her from history, emerging as this incredible icon of power, beauty, and religious radicalism.
And the core narrative, it relies entirely on a complex series of assumptions that we've unpacked today. We assume her parentage, likely A's daughter by a mysterious princess. We assume her political evolution,
from great royal wife to co-regent,
and eventually ruling as King Neferneferuaten, proven by that singular epithet, beneficial for her husband. And we assume the tragic cause of her death, a violent end driven by political upheaval.
And the challenge remains eternal for Egyptologists. New scientific methods, particularly the ongoing DNA analysis of mummies like the younger lady from KV35 and the poorly preserved ones from KV21, they continue to challenge the accepted truth.
They do. It forces the field to constantly reevaluate the entire Amarna family tree and succession timeline. Every new piece of evidence, whether it's a tiny fragment of graffiti or a complete genetic profile, has the potential to overturn 4 decades of previous scholarly consensus.
It's the ultimate historical puzzle.
It is. It's defined by absence rather than presence. Nefertiti exists in the gaps of history, demanding that we engage in critical thinking to reconstruct her truth.
Let's end with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If we accept the evidence of the younger lady mummy and the CT scans suggesting a fatal violent wound, and we accept that Nefertiti, as Neferneferuaten, was murdered for her moderate religious policy, that attempt to bridge the gap between the Antonists and the Amunists. What does that tell us about the political danger inherent in trying to steer a middle path during a time of radical change and religious upheaval? Was her effort to compromise ultimately seen as a critical weakness, drawing fire from both ideological extremes? Something for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends.